Welcome to our cozy channel. Here you will find gentle bedtime stories designed to help you unwind and drift off to peaceful sleep. Subscribe to join us every night on a journey into the world of tales. Before the colonists, America's ancient origins. When we look back to the beginnings of America's story, it is tempting to start with the arrival of European ships, the planting of new settlements, the clash of empires, and the rise of colonies that would one day form a new nation. Yet far before Jamestown's marshes or Plymouth's rocky shorelines, this land was ancient, cultivated and claimed, imagined and inhabited by peoples whose histories run deeper than the oldest documents in English, French or Spanish. To understand colonial America, the conflicts, compromises, cultures, and dreams that shaped a continent, we must first begin with the world that existed here before a single European cross or cannon ever appeared on its horizon. Arrival and early adaptation tense. Of thousands of years before Columbus, human beings made their first uncertain steps into North America. Archaeological evidence suggests that during the last Ice Age, waves of migrants hunting bands, families seeking new ground crossed into the continent, most likely via a land bridge exposed between Siberia and Alaska. Some may have threaded the icy coasts in small watercraft, hugging shorelines rich with resources. Others moved slowly southward, overland, following game and the shifting pulse of the seasons. Over generations, these first peoples spread in every direction. They moved through vast conifer forests, into open prairie and stony deserts, along rivers swollen with snowmelt, and eventually as far as tropical Central America and the temperate Andes. Where they settled, their presence shaped the world. Hunters tracked the mammoth and mastodon. Gatherers learned every edible plant and medicinal root. Some painted on cave walls or carved out tools, an art whose beauty has not faded with time. As millennia passed and the climate shifted, new horizons opened. Great animals died out, and bands of foragers experimented with seeds, rootstocks, and controlled burning. The birth of agriculture independent, locally adapted, and born of patience became the quiet revolution that allowed true cities to rise. The growth of early civilizations. The ancient American world was never a single society, but a patchwork of cultures, each shaped by geography, inheritance, adaptation, and exchange. In the woodlands of the Midwest, peoples we now call the Adena constructed vast ceremonial mounds, some shaped like animals, others spiraled for unknown purposes. Their descendants, associated with the Hopewell tradition, CE 200, BCE 500 CE, built even greater earthworks alongside intricate networks for trading obsidian, copper, shell, and mica across thousands of miles. Such achievements reveal a continent already connected long before European ships approached. Further south, civilizations like the Mississippian culture, c. 800, 1600 CE, raised cities and ceremonial centers whose scale startled the first Europeans to see their remains. At Cahokia, near today's St. Louis, tens of thousands once lived together in a metropolis of mounds, plazas, and neighborhoods. Massive wooden palisades protected central ceremonial spaces, evidence of astronomically aligned monuments and a complex social hierarchy. Priests, artisans, laborers, traders suggest an advanced, diverse, and often dynamic urban society. As the Mississippian world faded stressed by environmental change, disease, and inner strife, new powers and patterns emerged across the continent. Some peoples, like the ancestors of the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, organized themselves as powerful confederacies, balancing warfare with sophisticated diplomacy and consensus government. Elsewhere, in the Great Lakes, eastern woodlands, and along the rivers of the southeast, hundreds of nations defined themselves by language, kinship, and ties to the land. Diversity. Across the continent, no single pattern of life dominated pre-colonial America. In the northeast, Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples practiced a mixed economy, hunting, fishing, gathering, and where environment allowed, cultivating corn, squash, beans, the Three Sisters, and tobacco. Summer villages grew large as crops ripened and war councils met. Winter required dispersal into smaller kin groups. Leadership depended on skill in persuasion and generosity, and many societies prized consensus above decree. In the southeast, chiefdoms such as the Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw built towns with council houses and elaborate religious ceremonies. Their economies balanced fishing, farming, and the extraction of goods for trade salt, stone, pottery with hunting and forging alliances. Some towns moved periodically, while others became central nodes in networks that could flex and withstand crisis. To the west, amid the dry canyons and mesas of the southwest, cultures like the ancestral Puebloans, formerly Anasazi, engineered multi-story adobe villages and cliff dwellings in places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Master irrigationists, they learned to grow crops in arid landscapes by channeling water and planting in harmony with the rains and the seasons. Their ceremonial life, visible in the kivas sunk beneath plazas, centered on cycles of nature, stories of emergence, and a cosmos observed with careful eyes. Farther north and west, hundreds of diverse nations flourished, from the dense villages of the Pacific coast, where cedar longhouses, totem poles, and ritual feasts marked the New Char Nulth, Tlingit, and Haida, to the highly mobile buffalo hunters and horse cultures of the Great Plains, a new adaptation only possible after Spanish horses arrived. California, with its dozens of languages and societies living in distinct ecozones, presents another story. Peoples skilled at netting fish, harvesting acorns, grinding grain, and weaving baskets whose delicacy remains unsurpassed. In the far north, Inuit and Aleut societies pioneered Arctic survival living with the ice, hunting seals and whales, and relying on collective ingenuity. What united this diversity was not politics or even a single religious vision, but an enduring sense of place, of kin, and of connectedness to the cycles of the land. Interconnected worlds trade bound the continent together long before Europeans appeared. Flint from the Rockies, copper from the lakes, shells from the Gulf, obsidian from the west, and ceremonial objects traveled along routes carried by traders and guided by story. Marriages linked clans, alliances joined nations, and sometimes confederacies gave stability to a turbulent world. Conflicts were real. Nations fought over land, resources, and prestige. Captives were sometimes adopted as kin, sometimes held or traded for wealth. Disease occasionally swept through, though nothing compared to what would follow in the wake of European contact. First contact, Norse sailors and distant visitors. For most of America, the first meaningful contact with Europe came suddenly, after millennia of independent development. But there were footnotes. Norse seafarers pushing west from Greenland and Iceland around 1000 CE, briefly settled and traded on the coast of what is now Newfoundland. Archaeological discoveries at L'Anse aux Meadows, confirm the Vinland sagas, describing encounters, sometimes violent, sometimes cautious, between Norse and native peoples. Yet these visits were soon abandoned, leaving little lasting mark on the continent's broad societies. Even after the Norse, hints of indirect contact ripple through native oral histories. Stories of distant traders, strangers, or curious objects, but these were rare exceptions. For most communities, the world they knew was defined by local and regional relationships, familiar landscapes, and ancient stories. The land before empire. When European explorers and colonists finally arrived, they entered a world governed by rules and rhythms they barely recognized. Every river had a history, every field a name, every village a claim. There were no empty lands. Every patch of forest or open prairie supported someone's sustenance, memory, or prayer. What's more, the first encounters unfolded against a backdrop of crisis. By the time Spanish, French, and English ventures pushed deep into North America, many native societies were living through upheavals, some legacy of the Mississippian collapse, some consequence of new migrations or ecological shocks. Thus, Europe entered a continent in flux, dynamic and resilient, but not untouched by conflict and change. The stage is set. It is in this ancient world of complexity and deep presence that the drama of colonial America would play out. The story that follows of conquest, epidemic, dialogue, resistance, accommodation, and transformation would forever alter both the continent and its new arrivals. Yet the very endurance, diversity, and ingenuity of North America's first peoples would ensure they remain central to that story, not merely as victims or obstacles, but as shapers and survivors in the making of a new world. Part 2. Encounter and Catastrophe. The first waves of European contact. As the 16th century dawned, the lands and peoples of North America held to their own rhythms. Ceremonies were performed, crops tended, hunting parties organized, marriages brokered, and alliances made or broken as they had been for centuries. Yet fate waited on the horizon, painted on the sails of ships whose origins were imagined only dimly, if at all, by the continent's ancient nations. When sailors from Spain, France, and England first arrived, they did not bring merely trade goods or Christian gospels. They brought a tide of change that would remake the continent, sometimes violently and often irrevocably. The Columbian Exchange, an ecological revolution. The movement of people from Europe into the Americas initiated a shattering process later called the Columbian Exchange. This vast transfer of plants, animals, people, technology, ideas, and perhaps most fatefully, diseases, marks a pivot in the world history. Into the Americas came old world crops wheat that would soon cover the prairies, sugarcane that would refashion the economy of the Caribbean and the South, horses that would transform the plains, pigs, cattle, sheep, even weeds hitherto unknown. From the Americas, Europeans received maize, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, tobacco, and chocolate, products that would in time touch every table from Moscow to Timbuktu. Some of these changes delighted old world palates and merchants. Others, truly, remade ways of life. The horse, for instance, once reintroduced on the continent by the Spanish, soon spread through indigenous networks at nearly unimaginable speed, transforming the hunting, warfare, and status systems of the Great Plains. Other exchanges would prove far more deadly. Disease, the silent conquest, far deadlier than steel or gunpowder, were the invisible riders on every breeze that followed European landfalls. Pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases raced ahead of colonizers on the tide of trade and movement, cutting down populations that had never before encountered such viruses and bacteria. Lacking immunity afforded by centuries of exposure in Eurasian cities, native communities were defenseless. Village after village, what began as isolated outbreaks swelled into continental plagues. Survivors watched as entire towns emptied. Oral histories would later remember years of mourning, of burned villages to halt infection, of nations fractured as elders, medicine people, and warriors all perished indiscriminately. Demographic studies, as imprecise as they must be for those distant centuries, suggest that in some regions, 9 in every 10 people may have died within a few short generations. The shock to society was immense. Fields were left untended, alliances shattered by grief, and with populations so drastically reduced, entire cultures shrank, fragmented, or merged with neighbors for survival. In many places, the landscape bore silent witness: untended mounds, empty villages, and forests suddenly regrowing on land once carefully managed. This catastrophe, more than any fleet of ships or company of soldiers, prepared the ground for European intrusion. When explorers wandered rivers and forests, marveling at empty lands or sparse villages, they often failed to see that what looked empty to them was the aftermath of apocalypse. Early explorers, conquistadors, traders, and missionaries, Europe's first agents in North America, were rarely organized settlers. Rather, they were adventurers, soldiers, friars, and traders working for profit, protection, or spiritual conquest. The Spanish came earliest and in greatest numbers at first, probing along the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, and up the rivers of what would become the southern United States. Their legacy is written in the names they left behind: Florida, Rio Grande, San Antonio, Santa Fe, and in the scars their expeditions left on native societies. Spanish conquistadors, driven by tales of gold-rich cities, marched across unfamiliar lands. Hernando de Soto wandering the southeast, leaving violence, disease, and confusion in his wake. Coronado searching the plains for fabled cities of gold. Many of these missions ended in exhaustion and disappointment. Yet the Spanish foothold grew, especially through a chain of missions and presidios, forts, stretching from St. Augustine in Florida across the Southwest. Friars, as much as soldiers, became the agents of empire, their olive-skinned statues appearing in painted adobe outposts, their sermons and schools a twin-edged sword that protected some while undermining the ways of others. To the north, French fishermen plied the storm-tossed Grand Banks for cod, their sails flapping with the hope of profit as their predecessors had for generations along the coasts of Normandy and Brittany. This maritime presence morphed, in time, into a network reaching from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. French explorers Champlain, La Salle, Marquette, Joliet-led expeditions, powered as much by the fur trade and alliances with indigenous nations as by dreams of empire. The English, somewhat late to begin compared to Spaniard or Frenchman, watched these developments with envy and ambition. The stage was thus set for a tangled contest, not only among Europe's great powers, but even more consequentially, among the native nations, whose interests, rivalries, and fates would become enmeshed in a swelling struggle for land, resources, and authority. Indigenous strategies: alliance, adaptation, resistance. The arrival of Europeans, and with them new tools, goods, and dangers, did not reduce Native Americans to passive figures swept along by fate. Everywhere, leaders, councils, and warriors debated how to respond. To be sure, the scale and pace of change was overwhelming. Disease depopulated, trade transformed economies and altered ancient balances, and violence could erupt wherever misunderstandings or competition fled. But indigenous peoples responded with agency, sometimes allying with newcomers to gain leverage over old enemies, sometimes adopting new goods with surprising speed, and sometimes fighting desperately and often effectively to hold their ground. To many villagers, a European musket was a tool of survival against neighbors armed only with bows, at least until the latter could obtain firearms themselves. Iron tools, copper kettles, beads, and cloth soon became woven into cultures that prized not just tradition, but trade, adaptation, and prestige. Wampum, already an essential medium of diplomacy in the Northeast, took on new roles as European traders, and colonial governments sought to put value on things differently measured before. Devastation was not universal, nor was resistance always futile. The Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680, for example, saw indigenous peoples across what is now New Mexico united by shared grievances against religious repression and forced labor overthrow Spanish authority for a generation. The combination of strategy, unity, and luck allowed the Pueblos to maintain cultural autonomy for years, and when Spanish rule resumed, it did so in a more accommodating guise. Elsewhere, nations like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Huron, the Powhatan in Virginia, and the Wampanoag in New England all made complex calculations, at times entering into trade or military alliances, at times seeking to buffer European power with diplomacy or by carefully balancing one empire against another. Even in defeat, indigenous societies would continue to shape the colonists' lives, sometimes as adversaries, sometimes, ironically, as cultural models in fields ranging from agriculture to warfare and even governance. Norse Interlude and the battle for North American shores. While most marks of early European presence were Spanish or French, the evidence left by the Norse centuries earlier on the windswept shores of Newfoundland was rediscovered in the 20th century. Timbers, ironwork, and the faint remnants of sod houses at L'Anse aux Meadows hinted at stories kept alive in Icelandic sagas. Unlike the later influx from Iberia and France, these Norse ventures left little trace of long-term cultural or epidemiological impact. Their foray, cut short by distance, difficulty, and resistance from indigenous inhabitants, simply becomes another chapter in the long human exploration of the American continent, an echo rather than a first act. With European powers now engaged in a frenzied competition for the continent's riches, two models of colonial interaction soon emerged. The Spanish, undergirded by the twin missions of conquest and conversion, demanded dominance, often through settlement and the imposition of European social hierarchies. By contrast, the French, with fewer settlers and weaker logistical support, depended on forging alliances, especially for the lucrative fur trade. French traders learned native languages, intermarried, and sometimes adapted their own practices to suit their powerful indigenous partners. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, while seeking conversion with zeal, also spent long months or years in indigenous villages, recording observations that would later be invaluable if not always, impartial windows into native life. Still, such distinctions could blur. In the borderlands between empires and nations, collaboration, violence, and negotiation all intermingled, and the fates of European settlements always depended, at least as much as their own planning, on the choices, pressures, and accommodations of indigenous peoples. Patterns of colonization. As the 16th and early 17th centuries unfolded, the outlines of Europe's colonial patterns came into focus. Spain's sigil marked out the south and southwest from St. Augustine, the oldest European city in what would become the United States, to Santa Fe, to the Presidios lining the California coast. France extended tendrils from Quebec and Montreal, carving out New France through inland riverways and trading posts, and relying on native partners, sometimes as equals, sometimes as clients. English ambitions were slow to blossom. Early attempts at colonization failed dramatically, most infamously at Roanoke, the lost colony. Later, lands claimed as Virginia, honoring England's Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, would become the proving ground for new models of settlement, financed by joint stock companies, royal charters, and private fortunes. Nowhere was this more evident than at Jamestown. Established in 1607 as an enterprise of the Virginia Company of London, the settlement would become England's first enduring North American foothold, though only just. Racked by disease, poor planning, hunger, and uneasy relations with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, Jamestown teetered on the edge of ruin for years. Only a mix of indigenous diplomacy, new waves of settlers, and a turn to tobacco cultivation as a cash crop salvaged its fortunes, albeit at the price of accelerating expansion into native lands and the emergence of a brutal system of labor. The invention of America, a chaotic mosaic. So began the process by which European colonizers would invent America anew, fashioning, often in ignorance or disregard of what had come before, settlements, plantations, missions, and towns out of an ancient land and upon the lives of its first peoples. Yet this was not, and never could be, a one-sided creation. Every farm on cleared Algonquian ground, every presidio built near a Pueblo well, every trade post on a native road was a place of encounter, a spot where multiple worlds collided, mingled, and remade each other. Languages blended and changed. Diets shifted as maize and beans found European fields, and pork, wheat, and cattle ran wild across the continent. Clothing, houses, even weapons became hybrid forms. Lines of kinship might cross ethnic lines and national boundaries, and amid destruction and devastation, new societies, Creole, Métis, Mestizo, African, Indigenous, and European took shape along the continent's edges and in its contested heart. It was, and would always be, a world of both rupture and continuity. The profound disruptions of disease, violence, and colonization brought chaos, grief, and transformation. But the story of early America is a story too of persistence, adaptation, and the ceaseless reinvention of worlds by all who called it home. Part 3. Planting the seeds of empire. Early English colonization and the Chesapeake. By the early 1600s, the great European powers were no longer content with tentative exploration or transient outposts. Their ambitions hardened into colonies' permanent settlements, meant to extract wealth, claim territory, and recreate old world societies in a new world context. Spanish and French efforts had already cast long shadows across the continent, but the arrival of the English would prove transformative. With them came not only new crops and markets, but a distinct social order, legal traditions, and the seeds of representative self-government that would one day challenge the very notion of empire. Jamestown, the precarious beginning. In the Virginia Tidewater in 1607, the first enduring English colony on North America's mainland took shape at Jamestown. The venture was as much an act of commerce as of conquest, financed by the Virginia Company of London, backed by investors seeking profit as much as permanence. Jamestown began amid disarray. The river marshes bred swarms of mosquitoes that carried disease. The brackish water could not support life for long. Most of the first settlers were not farmers, but gentlemen and soldiers, ill-suited for the rigors of cultivating land or surviving in a strange and sometimes hostile world. The closest indigenous power, the Powhatan Confederacy, was no passive bystander. Ruled by Wahun Sunakok, named Powhatan by the English, his alliance bestowed resources and protection upon tributary villages stretching for miles through coastal Virginia. His people generously traded with the newcomers, offering maize in the early years and negotiating terms for mutual support. But misunderstandings and competition over resources, land, and sovereignty quickly frayed these ties. Famously, the story of Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, would become legend her role as intermediary recast through centuries of romanticization, but in fact reflecting the real negotiation, compromise, and tension between two fundamentally different worlds. Starving time and hard lessons. The next years confronted Jamestown with devastation. In the starving time of 1609-1610, crop failures, lack of trade, and outright violence with the Powhatan nearly spelled doom for the colony. Letters home tell of hunger so dire that settlers ate anything: horses, dogs, rats, even shoe leather. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests the desperation led, at times, to cannibalism. Only the arrival of supply fleets and new settlers, combined with increasingly harsh discipline under martial law, kept Jamestown from ruin. Strict codes enforced order and incentivized productivity. John Smith, the colony's most famous early leader, insisted, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." A rule born more of dire necessity than theory. Shah. Tobacco, the golden crop and its consequences. Salvation for Jamestown and for English America came not in gold or spices, but in a leaf, tobacco. Indigenous peoples of the region had long cultivated and used tobacco for spiritual and social purposes. English colonists, refining cultivation methods and growing a strain suited to European tastes, turned it into a cash crop that flowed rapidly into English markets, fetching high prices and immediate demand. Tobacco's success shaped everything about Chesapeake society. Its intensive cultivation ruined soil quickly, driving planters ever outward in search of new land, thus fueling the insatiable appetite for native territory. Large plantations began to dominate the best land along rivers, setting the foundation for a rural, spread-out settlement pattern, quite unlike the towns of New England or the trading posts of New France. Equally significant was tobacco's labor demand. In the early years, the English answered this need with indentured servants, poor men and women from England, Ireland, and elsewhere, who signed contracts obligating them to several years of hard labor in exchange for passage to the New World. At the end of their service, many hoped to claim land and start new lives, though in reality, few prospered. Disease, mistreatment, and broken promises ensured that many never survived their term. The so-called headright system further reshaped society. For each laborer a planter transported to Virginia, they received a grant of land. Those able to pay the passage for many servants rapidly accumulated large land holdings and entrenched their status as an emerging elite. The arrival and codification of slavery. While indentured servitude had long been a cornerstone of the Chesapeake economy, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia by 1619, taken from a Portuguese slaver by English privateers and traded to desperate planters. At first, Africans may have lived under a confusing mix of statuses. Some were held as servants able to gain freedom, others as lifetime slaves, and a few, remarkably, became landowners themselves in the colony's unstable early decades. By the late 17th century, however, planters in Virginia and Maryland moved determinedly toward a fully racialized, hereditary system of African slavery. Laws declared that children inherited the status of their mothers, ensuring the permanency of the system and generational enslavement. Racial boundaries hardened, fueled by economic expedience, fears of servant unrest, and the logic of profit. Slavery became the bedrock of the region's agricultural and social order, even as white servants remained an important part of the workforce for generations. Conflict within and without colonial life brought stark inequality. At the top stood the great planters' men of land and wealth, who shaped local government, justice, and church life. At the bottom were servants, the poor, and enslaved people with virtually no rights, and with life often marked by violence and precarity. In between struggled a growing group of small farmers and former servants, many unable to gain the best land or rise in status. Tensions simmered, especially as free white men, pushed to the frontier or starved of opportunity by planter dominance, found themselves exposed to risk from both indigenous groups and a distant colonial government. These issues boiled over in Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, when a coalition of disgruntled frontiersmen, servants, and opportunists led by Nathaniel Bacon attacked both indigenous neighbors and challenged the authority of Virginia's governor. Though the rebellion ultimately collapsed, it terrified the colonial elite, demonstrating the dangers of a landless, discontented, white underclass. In the aftermath, Virginia's leaders deliberately encouraged a deeper racial divide, offering certain protections and privileges to poor whites in exchange for their support against both enslaved Africans and Native Americans. The resulting racial solidarity would have long-lasting consequences, underpinning a social order where race and property trumped all other distinctions. Maryland, experiment in toleration and tobacco. While Virginia grew as a royal colony dominated by tobacco planters and Anglican churchmen, its neighbor Maryland was granted as a proprietary colony to the Catholic Calverts, Lords Baltimore, in 1632. Intended as a refuge for Catholic gentry facing persecution in England, Maryland in practice quickly resembled Virginia. Its climate and rivers favored tobacco, its elites amassed land and labor, and large Protestant migrations created religious tensions. Maryland is remembered for its early experiment with religious toleration, its 1649 Act concerning religion, granting freedom of worship for all Christians. Yet, this toleration was more fragile than robust and crumbled repeatedly in the face of political tensions as Protestant majorities and Catholic proprietors vied for power. In the long run, economics, tobacco, land, and labor overwhelmed religious differences in shaping the colony's destiny. Daily life in the early Chesapeake. For ordinary people, life in 17th century Chesapeake was hard and often brief. Disease, malaria, dysentery, and fever killed many settlers, especially in their first years. The population growth depended heavily on new arrivals from Europe and, increasingly, Africa. Women were few, especially in early decades, and often wielded a rare economic power, choosing among suitors and inheriting property when widowed. Society was rough, with feuds, lawsuits, and physical punishments common. The Anglican Church, established by law, provided religious structure, but little of the close-knit community found elsewhere. For enslaved Africans, family ties were fragile, subject to the whims of owners, and life's rhythms were governed by endless labor in fields, homes, or workshops. Small acts of resistance slowing work, preserving stories and songs, even running away, proved that even within oppression, humans strove for dignity and connection. The Chesapeake in the Atlantic world. Yet even as the Chesapeake began to stabilize, it existed not as a world apart, but as part of an emerging global marketplace. Tobacco flowed to England. Manufactured goods cloth, metal tools, crockery, and luxury items sailed back. The wealth generated through this commerce entrenched planter dominance, but also bound the colony through debt and law to England's emerging empire. Slave ships, rum, and sugar products harvested with African labor in the Caribbean linked the Chesapeake even more tightly into Atlantic circuits, foreshadowing the triangular trade networks that would define much of colonial America. Part 4. New England. Visions, covenants, and community on the edge. While the Chesapeake colonies were defined by tobacco, expansive plantations, and stubborn climbs up the ladder of profit and power, the settlements that arose further north along the stony coastline of New England followed a different rhythm. Here, from the earliest days, communities imagined themselves shaped not by the chase of export crops, but by the force of shared ideals, religious discipline, and the bonds of mutual obligation. The story of New England is, above all, a story of vision, sometimes noble, sometimes harsh, about what society could and should be on the edge of the known world. The Puritan migration and the idea of a city upon a hill. The roots of New England were planted in the religious upheavals of early modern England. The Protestant Reformation had split Christendom across Western Europe and, in England, triggered waves of contention as monarchs and parliaments alternately enforced and resisted reforms in faith and ritual. Among the reformers were the Puritans, men and women who believed that the Church of England remained too close to Roman Catholicism, retaining vestiges of idolatry, hierarchy, and superstition. What Puritans sought, most of all, was purification of the church, of society, and of individual life. Some Puritans chose to separate, entirely forming independent congregations that worshipped in ways forbidden by law. For these separatists, persecution was a fact of daily life. One such group, after a period of exile in Leiden in the Dutch Republic, secured passage to North America aboard the Mayflower in 1620. Blown off course, they landed far north of the Virginia Territory, for which they had a patent, at a place they named Plymouth. Lacking official sanction, they drew up their own brief agreement, the Mayflower Compact, promising to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. This moment, later enshrined in American memory, was crucial. Government by consent, rule by the majority, and collective responsibility took precedence over the personal rule of an aristocrat or king. The first winter at Plymouth was brutal. Half the company died from exposure and disease. Survival, as at Jamestown, depended upon aid from nearby indigenous people, especially the Wampanoag, whose knowledge of crops and seasons proved essential. The feast, remembered as the first Thanksgiving, marked not just a harvest, but a fleeting moment of cooperation amid a coming era of tension. But the Plymouth colony remained small and poor for decades. A more consequential migration came in 1630, when a fleet of Puritan settlers, led by John Winthrop and backed by the Massachusetts Bay Company, landed further north and established Boston. Winthrop had articulated their mission with striking clarity. They were to be a city upon a hill, watched by the world and accountable to God for their success or failure. Their covenant, spiritual as well as civil, would bind them together in mutual responsibility. A godly commonwealth, society and government. The settlements of Massachusetts and spreading New England towns were not scattered plantations, as in the South, but nucleated villages clustered around a meeting house, both a church and the seat of local government. The town was the foundation. Each man who was a member of the church and therefore judged a person of upright faith could participate in town meeting, where local issues, taxes, fences, education, care for the poor were decided collectively by direct vote. This tradition would prove remarkably durable, seeding habits of discussion, self-government, and community oversight that outlasted the Puritan era and profoundly influenced the politics of Massachusetts and beyond. The General Court, or colonial legislature, combined elements of elected representation and deference to authority. Early on, only male members in good standing with the church could vote. Ministers led communities, though rarely in office themselves. The lines between civil and religious authority were blurred, not only in law, but in daily life. Congregations exercised discipline over members, investigated private sins, and expected even private households to mirror the godly order that leaders believed would usher in a better world. Patterns of settlement and economy. Land in New England was less fertile and more fragmented than in the Chesapeake. Though some large grants created manors and estates, most families farmed smaller plots, growing mixed crops, grain, vegetables, apples, combined with fishing, trade, and artisan work. The rocky soil never yielded a single lucrative export to match tobacco or sugar. Instead, New England's wealth, such as it came, grew from diversified work: sawmills, fisheries, shipbuilding, small exchanges with the West Indies, especially exporting salted fish in return for Caribbean molasses and rum, and as towns grew, local industry and trade. These economic patterns encouraged a society of relatively broad land ownership and social mobility, in sharp contrast to the plantation aristocracies further south. While inequality surely arose, most towns boasted strong middling classes, yeoman farmers, craftsmen, and traders who took pride in their independence and voices in local affairs. Education was another Puritan focus, because every person needed to read scripture. Literacy was widespread, and towns by law supported grammar schools. In 1636, Massachusetts Bay established Harvard College to train ministers. The region's intellectual intensity fostered not only religious debates, but in time, innovation in commerce, politics, and science. Dissent, conformity, and the limits of tolerance. Yet the strong communal bonds of New England were double-edged. The culture of mutual surveillance, suspicion of private error, and the fear of God's judgment could become oppressive. Not all who came to the Promised Land agreed with their neighbors, and not all dissent could be contained quietly. Roger Williams, a minister full of passionate convictions, challenged the authority of both church and magistrate, declaring that true faith required complete soul freedom and that civil authority should not coerce religious belief. He also condemned the English practice of claiming vacant land, insisting that colonists had to truly purchase land from its native inhabitants. Banished from Massachusetts for his views, Williams found sanctuary among the Narragansett and founded Providence Soon, Rhode Island, built explicitly on principles of religious liberty and separation of church and state. Anne Hutchinson, a charismatic and learned woman, hosted meetings in her home and openly criticized local ministers, teaching that God's grace alone, not acts, was the path to salvation. She too was banished after a scandalous trial and eventually moved to Rhode Island, then New Netherland. These and others, Quakers, Baptists, dissenters, were driven out, and in their wake spread new settlements, each testing the boundaries of what could be tolerated in the city on a hill. By the late 17th century, the spirit of religious conformity in New England, embodied most infamously in the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, had begun to confront the realities of diversity, legal reform, and imperial oversight. Yet the memory and myth of a united, godly commonwealth remained potent. Conflict with indigenous peoples. New England's expansion brought it inevitably into conflict with the region's native nations. Early coexistence broke down as towns multiplied, livestock strayed into native fields, and English courts asserted authority over land transactions. The native people often understood differently. The Pequot War, 1636-1637, marked a convulsive bloodletting. English soldiers and their native allies destroyed Pequot villages, effectively erasing the Pequot as a political force and setting a precedent for English expansion by force. By the 1670s, tension reached breaking point in a devastating conflict known as King Philip's War. The Wampanoag Sachem Metacom, called King Philip by the English, whose father had once allied with the Pilgrims, led a coalition of tribes against encroaching English settlements. The war was brutal and decisive. Villages burned, hundreds killed, and thousands more dispossessed or sold into slavery. In the aftermath, southern New England's native nations were permanently subjugated, their lands absorbed, and colonial expansion accelerated. Scum. The larger New England arc. As the 17th century advanced, New England's map grew more complex. New Hampshire and Maine emerged from Massachusetts claims or proprietary grants. Connecticut, founded mainly by Puritan migrants, developed along the broad Connecticut River and often contested Dutch influence from nearby New Netherland. Town charters and local conflicts, some over religious doctrine, others over trade or territory, evolved into new colonies, all sharing a commitment to orderly, church-centered governance, but each negotiating its own path between order and freedom. The Union of New England Colonies, the New England Confederation, formed in 1643, attempted to coordinate defense, diplomacy, and policy, especially in the face of external threats. But persistent localism and powerful town allegiances meant that unity was usually more aspiration than achievement. Witchcraft, anxiety, and the changing world. New England's famous witchcraft outbreak at Salem in 1692 is much more than a story of mass hysteria. It reveals profound anxieties about gender, generational change, and the fragility of the Puritan mission. As older settlements divided, new generations challenged parental authority. As economic opportunities shifted, so too did communal loyalties. As a new royal charter revoked the tight theocracy of early Massachusetts, conformity weakened. The legal repression of witches, mainly women, seen as threats to the community's order, reflected both old world superstition and very colonial anxieties about the fading promise of the original errand into the wilderness. The end of the trials marked, for many, the beginning of a more rational age, but also signaled the slow erosion of utopian cohesion that had defined New England's first wave. The enduring legacy. By century's end, the Puritan experiment had changed. Larger royal colonies, New York to the south, French Quebec to the north and west, hemmed in expansion. The English crown and its governors pressed for more control, new laws, and broader toleration. Yet the framework of New England settlement, its town meetings, schools, respect for education, habits of governance, and ethos of mutual obligation laid the foundation for a society profoundly engaged in debate, reform, dissent, and, when the moment required it, resistance. Part 5. The Middle Colonies: Diversity, Tolerance, and the Rise of Colonial Cities. Between the Puritan villages of New England and the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, stretched a region whose defining feature was, unlike its neighbors, not a single crop, religion, or ethnicity, but heterogeneity. Here, along the broadest rivers and most fertile valleys of early America, the world's peoples rubbed shoulders. Dutch and English merchants, German and Swedish farmers, Quaker idealists, indentured servants, Africans both enslaved and free, and indomitable indigenous nations forged a complex colonial mosaic. The story of the Middle Colonies is one of negotiation, ambition, and adaptation, a story of how differences learn to live, however uneasily, side by side. New Netherland: Dutch ambition and American reality. The Dutch, masters of commerce and wind, were among the first Europeans to see profit in North America's rivers and furs. The West India Company, flush from colonial ventures in the Caribbean and Brazil, chartered Henry Hudson to explore the region, and by 1694, Dutch traders had established a foothold at the mouth of the river he had charted, the Hudson. There, on the island of Manhattan, New Amsterdam was born. New Netherland radiated upriver toward Fort Orange, modern Albany, and westward along the Delaware. The colony was less a planned settlement than a commercial engine. Its towns were outposts of trade, its rural reaches opened by patroonships, vast landed estates granted to investors who promised to bring over tenants and laborers. Here, fur pelts flowed in from the interior, exchanged for beads, cloth, iron goods, and sometimes rum. Early New Amsterdam was noisy and rough. A city of muddy streets, windmills, taverns, crowded with sailors from every nation, and markets bustling with goods and gossip in as many languages as found in any Dutch port. Dutch Calvinists, Lutherans, Jews fleeing Iberian persecution, French Huguenots, Walloons, Africans, brought in chains, or as company servants, all passed under the blue, white, and orange flag of the Dutch Republic. Self-government in New Netherland was pragmatic, tolerant, and often lax in religious matters. As long as trade was brisk and taxes paid, company officials tolerated practices, whether Jewish, Quaker, or Catholic, that elsewhere in Europe would bring fines or worse. Yet the Dutch approach, focused on prosperity over unity, was double-edged. It gave the colony energy and diversity, but left it less cohesive and more vulnerable when English competitors cast greedy eyes on Manhattan's harbor. The English conquest and the making of New York. From the middle of the 1600s, England's navy and monarchy, eager for greater control over the Atlantic coast and over transatlantic trade, began asserting dominion. In 1664, as war with the Netherlands loomed, an English fleet sailed unopposed into New Amsterdam. Outnumbered and undersupplied, Director General Peter Stuyvesant surrendered. The Duke of York, later King James II, took possession, renaming the city New York and the surrounding region after his title. Though now English in law, the colony retained much of its Dutch flavor. Dutch families kept their lands, churches, and customs. English law respected previous grants and allowed a measure of religious and linguistic continuity. The fur trade and alliances with the powerful Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Confederacy up the Hudson remained the lifeblood of the backcountry. Over time, enslaved Africans arrived in growing numbers, their labor essential in cities and on farms alike. British authority in the new colony rested on a proprietary model in which favored nobles or investors received vast tracts. Yet New York also boasted a fractious population, merchants and artisans, chafed at heavy-handed governors, rural farmers, Dutch, German and Scots-Irish, often resentful of manor lords and skeptical of high taxes. Urban, polyglot and contentious, New York grew into the largest city in the colonies and a center of transatlantic culture, news and politics. New Jersey, the patchwork colony. Across the river, New Jersey's story was one of division and mixture. Its land passed from the Dutch to the English, then from the Duke of York to a succession of proprietors who, seeking rapid settlement, offered land grants, low taxes, and broad toleration. The result was a patchwork of towns, some centered on Quaker, Baptist, Dutch Reformed, or Scots Presbyterian congregations, each with its own customs and disputes. Over time, East Jersey, closer to New York, and West Jersey, leaning toward Philadelphia, merged into one royal colony. The lack of a single dominant church or ethnicity fostered a culture of negotiation and accommodation. Like New York, New Jersey's diversity bred both opportunity and chronic political squabbling, as English law, local tradition, and the ambitions of various religious groups collided over everything from land claims to the reading of the Bible. Pennsylvania, Quaker Promise, and the Holy Experiment. The most remarkable of the Middle Colonies was born not of commerce or conquest, but of religious conviction and innovative thinking. William Penn, son of a prominent English admiral, was granted a massive territory west of the Delaware River by King Charles II as repayment for family debts. Penn, a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, who believed in the inner light of divine revelation in all souls, envisioned his colony as a holy experiment, a place where conscience would be free, government fair, and land available for all. Arriving in 1682 and founding Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, Penn encountered a land already occupied by the Lenape, Delaware, and resettled Swedes, Finns, and Dutch. His approach to native peoples was unusual. He met with their sachems, negotiated land purchases, and wrote treaties in good faith. Though demographic and economic pressures would later unravel this peace. For several decades, Pennsylvania was notable for its generally harmonious relations with local nations compared to other colonies. Penn's frame of government established an assembly elected by free male property holders, pledged unprecedented religious liberty, at least for Christians, and limited arbitrary rule by proprietary governors. Land was distributed in manageable tracts, advertised across Europe, and quickly attracted a flood of settlers: English Quakers, German Mennonites, Lutherans, Moravians, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, Welsh Baptists, and Jews. Many came fleeing persecution or poverty, drawn by the promise of toleration and cheap land. Philadelphia soon became the largest city of the British colonies after New York and Boston, a crucible of artisans, merchants, printers, and radicals whose debates would shape the coming era. Streets laid out in a grid, with broad avenues and squares, echoed Enlightenment ideals of order, openness, and reason. The breadbasket of colonial America. The Middle Colony's climate and soil supported small to mid-sized farms, often operated by families, producing a surplus of grains, wheat, rye, barley, that earned Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York the nickname the bread colonies. These products, along with livestock, butter, and cheese from German and Dutch farmers, fed the cities and were exported to the West Indies and Europe. Market towns prospered along navigable rivers. Ferries and bridges connected rural communities to urban centers. Local artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, basket makers, coopers enjoyed steady demand. The region's relative prosperity allowed for a degree of stability and class mobility that set it apart from the rigid hierarchies of the South or the intensely communal world of New England. As the 18th century unfolded, German immigrants, often called Pennsylvania Dutch from Deutsch, settled vast stretches of the interior, developing their own language and traditions. Scots-Irish, many of them displaced from Northern Ireland, pressed to the western Delaware Valley and southern Appalachians, carving new communities on the frontier. Slavery, freedom, and urban life. While slavery played less of a role in the Middle Colonies than in the South, it was nevertheless present. Thousands of black men and women lived in bondage, especially in port cities. New York, already a bustling center of trade, relied on enslaved labor for building, domestic service, and skilled trades. Uprisings like the New York Slave Revolt of 1712 exposed the deep contradictions within a society that celebrated liberty while profiting from human bondage. For free and enslaved Africans, for indentured servants and the poor, urban life offered some anonymity and opportunities for work, as well as networks of mutual aid, church, and cultural survival. The legal system was harsh, with strict codes to suppress resistance. Over time, abolitionist voices, especially among Quakers, arose, planting seeds of future transformation. Religion and toleration in practice nowhere was the pluralism of the Middle Colonies, more apparent than in their churches. Anglican chapels stood beside Quaker meeting houses, Lutheran and Dutch Reformed congregations, synagogues, and Catholic parishes. Sectarians held heated public debates, but state-sanctioned religious persecution was rare compared to other parts of the world. Toleration, however, did not mean equality or harmony. Different groups jockeyed for power in municipal politics and courts. Prejudice, especially against Catholics and Jews, persisted. Schools and charities often catered to single denominations. Yet the constant negotiation among groups fostered a culture of compromise and, at times, innovation. The urban experience cities like New York and Philadelphia were the greatest urban centers in colonial America, hubs of commerce, information, and new ideas. Docks filled with ships plying the Atlantic and Caribbean. wharves teemed with laborers, craftsmen, and merchants. The earliest newspapers, printing presses, and post offices appeared, spreading news, literature, and dissent. Assorted trades and clubs flourished, library societies, debating groups, networks of philanthropy, and mutual aid. In this ferment, figures like Benjamin Franklin arose from humble origins to global renown printer, inventor, philosopher, and statesman, embodying the middle colony's unique blend of ambition, creativity, and civic-mindedness. Indigenous nations and the borders of settlement. Throughout these developments, the indigenous nations of the Delaware and Susquehanna valleys, the Lenape, Munsee, Shawnee, Susquehannock, and the mighty Haudenosaunee Confederacy, remained central players. Trade, diplomacy, and war shaped the frontier, as native leaders deftly played imperial rivals against each other while striving to maintain autonomy and protect ancestral lands. The so-called Covenant Chain allied the Iroquois with New York's colonial government, balancing the pressures of the French to the north and other native confederacies to the west. Yet encroachment, fraud, and outright violence were constant threats. As colonial settlement advanced, native sovereignty and ways of life came increasingly under siege. The Middle Colonies as a model and a paradox. The world that emerged in the Middle Colonies was at once a model and a paradox. On one hand, it championed liberty of conscience, open markets, and the mingling of many peoples. On the other, it was built on unfree labor, on indigenous dispossession, and on an order still overseen by distant imperial masters. Yet the legacy of this region, the habits of assembly and debate, the language of rights and tolerance, the entrepreneurial spirit and urban dynamism would ultimately shape the American character. As tensions with Britain rose, the Middle Colonies, with their multiplicity of voices and sharp-edged public sphere, would prove both testing ground and crucible for revolution. Part 6. The Plantation South. Slavery, Wealth, and Society in the Atlantic World. South of the breadbasket towns of the Middle Colonies, the warm, long-growing seasons and marshy lowlands of the southern mainland beckoned with dreams of wealth. Here, stretching from the fertile banks of the Ashley and Cooper rivers in the Carolinas down the Georgia coast and inward through rich bottomlands, colonial America's infamous plantation society took root. Its rise would be fueled not only by local ambition, but by the heaviest burdens of the Atlantic world, the trade in enslaved Africans, the creation of an uncompromising racial order, and the drive for export riches that would shape generations. The roots and logic of Southern colonization. The Carolinas, at their founding, were imagined as a grand experiment, blending English aristocracy with commercial ambition, chartered by King Charles II in the 1660s, and led by a mix of English nobles and Barbadian planters. The region from its first days bore the mark of the Caribbean: plantation crops, absentee landlords, and the social vision rooted in hierarchy and profit. Early Carolina was chaotic, a land of feuding settlers, shifting alliances with native groups and halting experiments in governance and defense. Planters tried many crops, most notably rice, which soon proved as profitable as tobacco did further north. Indigo, a blue dye in demand for British textiles, also found a crucial niche, supported by subsidies from the Crown. Cattle were grazed for sale to Caribbean islands deprived of open pasture, and naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, provided essentials for shipbuilding. But none of this would have proved sustainable without labor, a need so demanding, and deaths from disease and overwork so high that only African slavery could provide both the skills and the sheer numbers required. The Atlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. The plantation south was tightly woven into the Atlantic economy, its wealth and daily life depending on one of the most tragic chapters in global history, the forced migration of millions from West and Central Africa. Over more than 3 centuries, European traders, African intermediaries, and American planters together forged the triangular trade. Manufactured goods from Europe, cloth, guns, liquor were exchanged for people on the coast of Africa. Crammed into the dark, airless holds of slave ships, captives faced the horrors of the Middle Passage. Months at sea, shackled, underfed, exposed to disease and brutality. Many perished. Those who survived began new, often nightmarish, lives across the Americas. Enslaved Africans arrived in Charleston, Savannah, and the Chesapeake, sometimes in small groups, sometimes by the hundreds. Auctions unfolded on docks and in squares. Families torn apart with the stroke of a gavel. Their trauma and resilience became the backbone of Southern wealth. They drained swamps, planted and harvested rice, tended indigo, built homes and public works. Their skills and traditions indelibly marked the region's food, dialect, music, and religious life. Carolina and later Georgia were, for a time, places where Africans sometimes outnumbered Europeans. Plantation districts in South Carolina became laboratories of African survival and creativity. African languages, kinship traditions, and spiritual practices, preserved in secret or blended with new realities, laid the deep roots of Gullah Geechee culture, a unique Black America, born in the storm and struggle of enslavement. The structure of plantation society. Southern society developed into a sharply stratified world. At the top stood the large planters' men and families who claimed titles, amassed thousands of acres, and held hundreds in bondage. Their lives were marked by wealth, gentility, and a sense of their own superiority. Big houses, sometimes indulging in the airs of an English estate rose above fields worked by gangs of enslaved laborers. Planters dominated local governments, controlled courts and parish vestries, and dictated politics at every level. Below the planters were small farmers, some owning a few enslaved workers, many owning none. Their economic position was more precarious, their aspirations tied to the distant hope of joining the ranks of the elite. Still, even modest white farmers benefited from the structure of racial hierarchy that reserved privileges, legal protections, and opportunities for them, and defined Black people by law and custom as property. Poor white laborers, tenant farmers, frontier folk made up a volatile lower class, while sometimes struggling in poverty and cut off from the planters' wealth. Their whiteness granted them a social status denied to all people of African descent or indigenous ancestry. This artificially constructed sense of superiority, often enforced through violence or law, was a powerful glue holding this unequal world together. At the bottom were the enslaved men, women, and children whose lives were subject in law and daily reality to the whims and violence of their owners. They labored from sunup to sundown, bound to the land and often denied even basic recognition of family, faith, or personhood. Yet among themselves, they created communities rooted in African memory, shaped by Christian hope, focused on survival, resistance, and solidarity. The laws of slavery and control, as the plantation system matured, colonial assemblies passed ever harsher slave codes statutes that defined people as property, chattel, forbade literacy, worship, gatherings, and the owning of weapons, outlawed testimony against whites, and fixed the status of mother and child as lifelong slaves. Patrols, a form of rural police, roamed the countryside, hunting runaways, enforcing discipline, and standing as a constant reminder of white authority. Resistance was never absent. Enslaved people slowed work, sabotaged tools, organized secret meetings, and sometimes risked everything in escape or rebellion. Stono Rebellion of 1739, when dozens of enslaved men marched south towards Spanish Florida, hoping for freedom, ended in blood. Its memory prompted even tighter restrictions. In the swamps and woodlands, communities of Maroons, runaway slaves, sometimes survived for years, raiding plantations or living at the edge of colonial rule. Family, religion, and survival. Enslaved life was always under threat, and trauma separation by sale, sexual exploitation, and the omnipresent threat of violence. Yet within such brutality, Black Americans forged bonds of kinship and belonging. Family networks, even when fragile and at constant risk, gave meaning and purpose. Naming traditions, oral storytelling, and communal rituals preserved pieces of African heritage and reimagined strength in new circumstances. Religion offered another kind of refuge. Enslaved peoples encountered Christianity both as a tool of control planters, and ministers stressed obedience and passivity, and as a source of inspiration, solace, and coded resistance. The stories of exodus and deliverance, the promise of a just God, the songs and prayers shared away from the Master's house, all became wells of strength, hope, and eventually a distinctive American spirituality. Georgia, the contest for reform and profit. The southernmost mainland colony, Georgia, was chartered in 1732, partly as a buffer against Spanish Florida, and partly as a social experiment. Its founder, James Oglethorpe, sought to create a haven for the debtor poor of England and, initially, to ban slavery and limit the size of landholdings, hoping to model a society of yeoman farmers and artisans. This vision collapsed under economic reality and settler pressure. Rice and indigo became as lucrative there as in Carolina, and by the mid-1700s, Georgia too was a plantation society deeply enmeshed in the slave trade. Cities, ports, and the commercial South Charleston, Savannah, and Norfolk became major Atlantic ports, their wharves thronged with goods and people from around the world. Scottish and French merchants, Jewish traders, and seafarers of every background built lively urban communities teeming with shops, taverns, and warehouses. The elite imported fine furniture, books, and fashion from London. The reality beneath the glamour was human bondage. Urban slavery had different rhythms. Enslaved men and women hired out as artisans, laborers, and servants, sometimes able to develop networks or even earn small sums on the side. Yet everywhere, the law kept tight control. The South in the wider Atlantic world. The plantation South was no isolated provincial backwater. Planters corresponded with London merchants and Caribbean kin. They invested in shipping, sometimes sent their children to university in England. They kept up with European news and fashions. The profits of rice, indigo, and later cotton helped finance the rise of modern capitalism. Insurance, stock exchanges, factory production, and the global textile trade all interwove with Southern slavery. The region's role in the Atlantic world brought both power and dependency. wars between Britain, Spain, and France often turned Carolina into a battleground. Native nations, Creek, Cherokee, Yamasee, sought to set the terms of trade and alliance, but were threatened by land hunger, divides and rule tactics, and the constant shadow of violence. The invention of race and the logic of slavery. Justifying slavery became not only an economic matter, but an ideological one. Southern writers, clergy, and politicians, facing growing critiques from Quakers and other abolitionists, began to develop pseudo-scientific theories of racial difference, arguing that Africans were inherently suited to bondage, that slavery was a positive good or even a civilizing force. These ideas, rooted in power rather than fact, would haunt American life long after the plantation era ended. Yet the historical record is clear. The South's wealth, architecture, culture, and political power all rested on the labor and resilience of enslaved people. Their experience, testimony, and struggle form a central thread in the story of America. Part 7. Routines and Realities. Daily life in colonial America. Behind every broad sweep of empire and every battle for land and power, ordinary people, free and enslaved, men and women, children and elders lived day by day, building families, communities, and the patterned habits that defined colonial society. American life in the 17th and 18th centuries was complicated, varied, and deeply shaped by the physical environment, social order, and inherited tradition. But it was also a world where adaptation, creativity, and quiet negotiation shaped the meanings of home, work, and identity. Family, the basic unit. For colonists up and down the Atlantic coast, the family was the foundation of society, economically productive, emotionally essential, socially defining. Marriage was both partnership and duty. In Puritan New England, couples were expected to be joined not just by affection, but by shared religious purpose. In the Quaker and German rural communities of Pennsylvania, family governance and kin networks held power, property, and reputation. In the South, family included, by force, not only the planter kin, but the enslaved labor force, each group negotiating the bonds of necessity and domination. Colonial families were larger than today's standard. High child mortality meant that women were often almost constantly pregnant, and it was not unusual for a woman to bear 8 or even 10 children. Yet close communities and extended kin also helped raise and discipline children, especially when mothers died young, an all too common tragedy. Childhood itself was brief. By age 6 or 7, children began chores, feeding animals, gathering wood, minding younger siblings. By their teens, most colonial boys had begun apprenticeships or regular farm work, and girls were often preparing for early marriage, learning to manage both household and community obligations. The world of work. The shape of work in colonial America depended on gender, race, class, and region. In New England, clearing fields, planting corn, weaving, making clothes, and preserving food filled the long months. Men also built fences and boats, worked as carpenters, blacksmiths, or shoemakers, went to sea, or ran small shops. In the middle colonies, wheat and rye farming meant seasonal labor, but towns offered trades from coopers and printmakers to bakers and wheelwrights. Women's work was central, though often undervalued in law and tradition. Spinning, dyeing, food production, dairy, soap and candle making, medicine, and caring for infants and the elderly. In every region, women ran small enterprises selling butter or cheese, making clothing for neighbors, or even operating taverns, in part to supplement household economies, vulnerable to harvests, sickness, or loss. In the cities, artisans and journeymen jostled for position. Apprenticeship, typically beginning around the age of 12 or 13, taught a young boy a trade: carpentry, printing, tailoring, silversmithing, through years of hard work under a master. For the lucky and persistent, mastery led, eventually, to the right to open a shop and to join a guild or other professional group. For Black Americans, work was shaped by the realities of enslavement. On plantations, enslaved men and women labored in the fields, sometimes in gangs under the supervision of overseers, sometimes in task systems that left a few hours for tending subsistence crops, gardens, or gathering food from the wild. In urban settings, enslaved people worked as craftsmen, domestics, dog workers, and teamsters, often hired out at a profit to their masters. Small acts of resistance faked illness, slowdowns, theft, escape were an inevitable response to daily oppression. In the North, most people were not enslaved, but servants and bound children, sometimes white, sometimes of African descent, filled many of the most difficult or dangerous jobs. Indentured servitude, while theoretically offering a route to freedom and property, often meant years of hard labor, poor diet, and harsh discipline. Gender and society. The notion of patriarchy, the authority of men over household and community, was deeply entrenched, but in practice, women often wielded considerable influence and authority, particularly as managers of domestic life, small business, or farms during a husband's absence or after widowhood. In rural regions, a woman's knowledge of midwifery, herbal medicine, and household management often made her essential to the survival of neighbors as well as kin. Women's legal rights were highly restricted in most colonies. Under coverture, a married woman's property and rights were absorbed by her husband's legal person. Unmarried women and widows could own property, sue or be sued, and sign contracts, and in some towns, widows composed a notable property-owning class. Still, the social expectation was that women's contribution was for family, not public recognition, and disorderly women, those who defied norms or spoke out, could face scrutiny, fines, or even banishment. For enslaved and free Black women, survival meant not only workplace labor, but bearing, raising, feeding, and defending children in an environment where they could be separated by sale at any time. Some enslaved women became healers or respected spiritual figures, quietly blending African and Christian traditions. In towns and cities, Black and mixed-race women operated markets, ran laundry or food businesses, and sometimes became important economic figures within their communities. Housing and material life. A colonial home, be it a small New England saltbox, a Pennsylvania stone farmhouse, a Carolina plantation, or a Delaware log cabin, was a site of industry as much as shelter. Furniture was usually plain, handmade, and multifunctional. Most people owned only a few changes of clothes. Beds were shared, rooms crowded, and privacy a rare commodity. Houses sprang up first in the form of rough shelters, often only a single room, later expanding as families prospered or grew. Warmth and food preparation revolved around the hearth. Candles, and later, oil lamps provided scant light. In coastal cities and the homes of the wealthy, imported goods, mirrors, clocks, porcelain, silverware, became status symbols, marking the social boundaries of class and aspiration. In the South, the divide between the big house of the planter elite and the cabins or quarters of the enslaved was stark. In northern towns, social stratification could be measured in the size and decoration of one's house, the presence of books, imported goods, and even the quality of glass in the windows. Education and literacy. Attitudes toward education varied widely by region. In New England, religious emphasis on reading the Bible fostered a commitment to universal literacy. Towns were legally mandated to support schools, and dame schools taught young children the basics. Harvard College was founded as early as 1636, followed soon by Yale and the College of William and Mary in Virginia. In the middle and southern colonies, formal schooling was less widespread, often limited to the children of gentry or the urban elite. Tutors and small private academies offered education to boys and occasionally girls from families who could afford it. Girls' curricula focused on needlework, household management, and religious instruction. Print culture grew steadily. Small presses and newspapers spread news and debate from Boston and Philadelphia to Charleston. Almanacs, the most popular books after the Bible, offered practical advice, calendars, and humor. Literacy rates, while high in New England, possibly over 70% for men by the mid-1700s, lagged elsewhere, especially among women and rural folk. For enslaved people, education was often forbidden by law, though clandestine reading, songs, and oral tradition kept knowledge alive. Law, local government, and order colonial America prided itself on English liberties, a constellation of rights jury trial, local assemblies, the protection of property that varied in availability yet shaped people's sense of belonging. Local government was everywhere. New England towns were governed by direct democracy in town meetings. Southern counties were run by appointed justices of the peace, largely drawn from the plantation class. In the middle colonies, a patchwork of charters, Dutch and English traditions, and ethnic enclaves shaped legal culture. Churchgoers might face fines for absences, idlers could be punished with public shaming, and minor criminals, thieves or debtors, were whipped, put in stocks, or branded. Public shaming through the use of stocks, pillories, or scarlet letters sought to reinforce community norms. Marriage, inheritance, contracts, and land claims all ran through colonial courts, and a well-connected lawyer or magistrate could shape community life as decisively as any official imported from London. Colonial towns took seriously the care of the poor, often through a blend of religious charity and local taxes. Widows, orphans, the sick or injured might be put out to local families at community expense or maintained in almshouses. Religion, festivals, and social life religion colored every aspect of colonial life, though not always as strictly as the first generation of Puritans intended. Congregational churches in New England, Anglican parishes in the South, Quaker meetings in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and a swirl of denominations everywhere else made a patchwork of worship and dispute. Sunday was everywhere a day of rest and socializing. Church attendance was not only a sign of piety, but a civic obligation and an occasion for news, courtship, and gossip. Fasting days, harvest festivals, and days of Thanksgiving punctuated the year, as did market days, country fairs, and, in cities, public theater and music. For Black Americans, private worship and clandestine meetings gave life to a faith-blending African memory and Christian hope, a tradition that in time would transform American music and preaching. urban and rural worlds. Colonial life was overwhelmingly rural. More than 80% of people lived on farms or in small hamlets. But cities Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston were worlds unto themselves, bustling with porters, artisans, ships, ideas, and danger. In the tight quarters of city life, epidemics spread quickly, but so did news, inventions, and revolutions in taste and opinion. Urban, poor, free, or enslaved, new arrivals, apprentices, and sailors crowded into cheap lodgings, lived by their wits and connections, and, in times of crisis, drove riots and protests that could shake the political order. Daily colonial life, then, was an intricate dance between freedom and order, wealth and want, ambition and tradition. Families, laborers, and dreamers planted not only crops, but deep habits of community, resilience, and resistance that would one day remake their world. Part 8. Commerce, Consumption, and Empire. The rise of the colonial economy. By the middle of the 18th century, the British American colonies had become bustling centers of economic innovation and trade distinct from their European origins, yet tightly bound to imperial markets. The rhythms of daily life and the fortunes of families were increasingly shaped by a swelling stream of ships, goods, and ambitions crossing the Atlantic. Out of these exchanges grew not only prosperity and new comforts, but also new tensions between colonist and empire, regulation and resistance that would soon reconfigure America's destiny. Mercantilism and the imperial order. From the time of the earliest settlements, the English and later British government shaped its colonial relationship according to the philosophy of mercantilism. In this theory, a nation's wealth and power were measured by its reserves of gold and silver, and the path to prosperity was through a favorable balance of trade, selling more to others than one bought, and controlling markets and resources around the world. For Britain, colonies served a dual purpose. They produced raw materials, tobacco, rice, indigo, furs, timber, that could feed British industries, and they offered a captive market for British manufactured goods. The Navigation Acts, passed at intervals from the 1650s onward, made this system concrete. Certain colonial products could only be shipped to Britain or other British colonies, and much of the Atlantic trade had to travel in British ships with predominantly British crews. Some laws even dictated which goods colonists could produce for export. Hats, wool, iron, and other products were sometimes restricted lest they threatened British manufacturers back home. British customs officials and surveyors oversaw this trade, and, at least in theory, colonial ports rang with the orders of imperial law. Growth of trade and Atlantic networks. Despite these restrictions, or sometimes because of their flexibility and loopholes, trade exploded. Colonial merchants grew expert at negotiating the paperwork, bribing customs officials, and smuggling both forbidden imports and untaxed goods. New England shipbuilders built fast, sturdy vessel sloops, schooners, brigs that became the workhorses of Atlantic commerce. Boston, Newport, Philadelphia, and New York developed busy wharves with goods flowing to and from Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. The classic triangular trade is often used to describe these networks. New England rum and manufactured goods were shipped to West Africa, exchanged for enslaved people who endured the Middle Passage to the Caribbean or the southern mainland. Plantation products such as sugar, molasses, tobacco, and rice were then carried to North American and British markets. But in reality, these trades formed a tangled web. New Englanders shipped fish, lumber, and livestock to the Caribbean. The West Indies sent sugar and molasses north in return. European luxuries came into Charleston and New York. Furs and grain left for southern Europe and the Baltic. Southern planters, especially, sent tobacco and rice in bulk to London and Liverpool, where merchants supplied them with finished goods and, crucially, credit allowing them to buy before their crops were sold. This system fueled rapid economic expansion, yet created deep dependence on distant creditors and volatile markets. The Consumer Revolution. As economic growth quickened, colonial Americans found themselves in the midst of a consumer revolution. Imports of British goods soared: tea and sugar, ceramics and silverware, printed chintz and calico, clocks and watches, books and paintings, mirrors, and even novelties such as spectacles or playing cards. Owning these goods became a way to signal one's refinement and social standing. Even modest families aspired to a tea table, a looking glass, or an imported brass candlestick. Artisans, especially in port cities, found new markets for their work. Silversmiths shaped ornate teapots, cabinet makers crafted fashionable chairs and sideboards, printers and booksellers expanded the flow of newspapers, novels, and pamphlets. Shopkeepers offered not just basic necessities, but a taste of modern live pepper, coffee, exotic fabrics, and the tools of domestic improvement. Women were central to this transformation. As household managers and buyers, they made many of the decisions about what goods to purchase, how to set a table, or decorate a parlor. Their taste, work, and aspirations helped shape both the flow of imports and the success of local artisans. Money, credit, and risk. Colonial Americans rarely saw much hard currency. Gold and silver coins were always in short supply, and the patchwork of foreign coins in use, Spanish dollars, Dutch ducats, English guineas, revealed the ambiguity of economic sovereignty. Instead, most business was conducted on credit. Merchants offered accounts to customers. Planters bought tools and clothing on the promise of future harvests. British firms extended credit and expected payment only after tobacco or rice was sold in distant London. This system expanded opportunity, allowing families and businesses to live ahead of their means. But it made everyone vulnerable to the vagaries of markets, crop failures, war, and political change. A poor harvest, a ship lost at sea, or a sudden drop in tobacco prices could leave entire communities in ruin. Colonists repeatedly petitioned for more hard money or for permission to print paper currency. When local governments issued bills of credit, essentially early forms of money, British authorities often saw this as a threat to stable trade and imperial control, and tried to curb such experiments. The urban economy and port cities. As Atlantic trade expanded, the colonies' towns and port cities grew at unprecedented rates. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, and Charleston became centers not only of shipping and storage, but of commerce, communications, and culture. Here, lawyers, printers, clergymen, teachers, and doctors could make a living apart from the land. Here too, the earliest theaters, libraries, and debating societies flourished. Each city developed its own personality. Boston was famed for its schools and religious controversy. New York for commerce, complexity, and ethnic diversity. Philadelphia for Quaker civility and a bustling artisan economy. Charleston for elegance and its ties to European luxury. These cities connected the American countryside to the wider world. Farmers sent surplus goods in, bought imported wares in return, and grew ever more conscious of global fashions and markets. City dwellers lived cheek by jowl with sailors, laborers, enslaved servants, and newcomers from Europe and Africa. Epidemics, fires, and crime were regular threats. So too were new ideas. It was in town squares and taverns, print shops and wharves, that talk of rights, protest, and news from London first spread. Shakuenum, smuggling, resistance, and empire's limits. The mercantilist system, with all its regulations and taxes, prompted as much defiance as obedience. Smuggling illegal import and export of goods became both a practical reality and a patriotic cause. Colonial officials, some honest, some complicit, struggled to enforce the letter of the law when entire communities benefited from sidestepping it. Local juries often refused to convict smugglers, seeing them as neighbors rather than criminals. British authorities understood these difficulties and for decades exercised what historians call salutary neglect, a flexible, often indulgent oversight that permitted prosperity while keeping the colonies essentially loyal and profitable. Every once in a while, often during war, a crackdown would rekindle resentment. More customs officers arrived, stricter searches were ordered, and the seeds of protest grew. Changes in rural and frontier economies. Beyond the port city, economic life continued to change rapidly. In the interior of Pennsylvania, New York, and the southern backcountry, waves of Scots, Irish, Germans, and others tamed new farmland, cultivated wheat and rye, and raised livestock. Markets were often distant, but rising demand for food in cities and abroad encouraged greater production and an expanded rural economy. Frontier families built networks of exchange based on barter as well as cash. In places where currency was even scarcer, country pay, corn, tobacco, hides, or manufactured goods stood in for money. Storekeepers and itinerant peddlers spread goods, news, and ideas between countryside and town, helping knit together a vast and varied society. In coastal and river towns, fishing, shipbuilding, and whaling flourished. In the north woods of Maine and New Hampshire, lumber and mast cutting became a major business. The huge ships of the Royal Navy depended on tall New England pines. The tensions of prosperity. The colonial economy bred optimism and expansion, but also deep anxieties. Wealth was uneven. While a few possessed grand homes, imported silks, libraries, and even carriages, many more struggled. Tenant farmers, landless laborers, indentured servants, and enslaved people saw few of the fruits of prosperity. Debt plagued the ambitious. Failures or fluctuations led to court cases, bankruptcy, and even imprisonment. For enslaved people and the poor, the consumer revolution meant hard labor, making luxuries they would never enjoy. Many artisans, nervous of competition from imports, defended the rights of local production and used their skills to anchor communities and protests. Women often made, repaired, or reused household items out of necessity, not fashion. The increasing pace of consumption brought its own critics. Ministers called for simplicity, warned of vanity and pride, and condemned families who went into debt to keep up appearances. Yet the desire for comfort and the pursuit of gentility, refined manners, tasteful interiors, polished speech continued to spread. Imperial wars and the costs of empire. Colonial prosperity was always vulnerable to disturbances abroad. The wars of the 18th century, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, the 7 Years, French and Indian War, brought hardship as well as opportunity. Privateers made fortunes raiding enemy shipping. Farmers profited from supplying armies. but trade disruptions, impressment of sailors, and increased taxation reminded colonists of their place within a global struggle. Victory in the French and Indian War seemed to secure new opportunities, especially with the removal of French and some indigenous power from the interior. But it also brought new imperial demand-stationed soldiers, rising taxes to pay for defense, and orders that forced the colonies to shoulder their share of the imperial burden. Unwilling to return to the pre-war salutary neglect, British ministers began to tighten administration and collect revenue. In protest, American merchants, planters, and artisans would turn the tools of economic life boycotts, non-importation, and public shaming into weapons of resistance, setting the stage for revolution. The ties that bind and the seeds of division. Even as economic life bound the colonies to Britain and to each other more tightly than ever, it also created a sense of colonial difference, self-confidence, and eventually, suspicion. Americans saw themselves as partners in imperial growth, entitled to the rights of Englishmen. Yet they believed their prosperity and freedom had come from hard work, ingenuity, and local self-government, not from imperial favor. As the 1760s dawned, the world of consumer comfort and busy trade was about to be rocked by ham-fisted attempts from faraway London to regulate, tax, and reorder American life. The lessons learned in market, port, and workshop would soon be applied to street and assembly. American identity polyglot, outward-looking, pragmatic, ambitious was ready, if pressed, to challenge the empire that had nurtured it. Part 9. Spirit, Intellect, and the Public Sphere. The Great Awakening and the Making of Colonial Identity. By the mid-18th century, religious and intellectual life in the American colonies had entered a period of profound transformation. The currents of faith and reason, old orthodoxy and new dissent, traditional order and rising individualism churned beneath the surface of daily earnings, commerce, and politics. Out of this ferment emerged a colonial public sphere. Churches, meeting houses, newspapers, pamphlets, taverns, and assemblies, where ideas became action, and action, in time, would drive revolution. Religion in colonial society. Religion was woven deeply into every aspect of colonial life, shaping how people interpreted fortune and disappointment, marked time, built families, governed communities, and justified both oppression and freedom. Patterns of belief and worship, however, were not uniform. They varied dramatically by region and changed with each new generation and migration. In New England, Congregationalist, descendants of Puritanism, churches dominated. Town structures revolved around meeting houses. Pastors held intellectual and moral authority, and church membership often defined full participation in political life. The culture remained marked by moral discipline, regular worship, and a sense of collective purpose. Even as conformity faded and diversity forced accommodation. In the South, the Church of England, Anglican, was established by law, at least among the planter class, with parishes supporting both religious and civic functions. Anglican rectors, educated and often closely tied to Britain, held secure posts. Yet in the backcountry, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, and other dissenters built their own meeting houses, sometimes facing harassment or exclusion, and kindled new spiritual energy, especially among poorer whites and the enslaved. The middle colonies were a patchwork: Quakers, Lutherans, Mennonites, Moravians, Reformed Presbyterians, Anglicans, Jews, and Catholics. Here, the ideals of liberty of conscience met practical necessity, religious toleration did not always mean harmony, but it created a climate of negotiation rather than outright repression, and it allowed new sects and spiritual movements to flourish. The Great Awakening, a wave of revival, beginning in the 1730s and sweeping through the 1740s and beyond. The Great Awakening was a series of evangelical religious revivals that shattered the complacency of colonial churches, challenged traditional elites, and forged powerful emotional bonds across towns, regions, and social divisions. The awakening emphasized personal conversion, new birth, heartfelt faith, and direct experience of the divine, denouncing the cold formalism of established ministers and the reliance on outward conformity and intellectual assent. Dramatic, itinerant preachers among them, the Connecticut theologian Jonathan Edwards and English evangelist George Whitefield, preached to thousands in open fields, urging sinners to repent, welcome God's grace, and live transformed lives. Edwards' sermons, blending fire and brimstone terror with eloquence, called on listeners to envision both the danger of damnation and the possibility of redemption. Sinners in the hands of an angry God became one of the best-known sermons, not just as theology, but as a crystallization of a society in spiritual tension. Whitefield, a charismatic Anglican who traveled from Maine to Georgia, electrified crowds of tens of thousands. His voice carried over rain and wind, his simple, emotional appeals welcoming men and women, young and old, enslaved and free. In places where people had rarely seen a clergyman, let alone heard themselves addressed as equals before God, the experience was transformative. Awakenings did not simply add numbers to church rolls. They produced deep social aftershocks, splits between new lights, revivalists, and old lights, traditionalists, new churches and colleges, Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth, founded to train ministers sympathetic to revival, and an enduring emphasis on lay participation, testimony, and the right of ordinary people to interpret Scripture and question authority. The effects on society. The Great Awakening swept through all classes and many regions, but it resonated especially among those on society's margins. Enslaved and free Black Americans participated in open-air meetings and sometimes created their own invisible churches, drawing on African spiritual traditions while embracing a faith that promised ultimate equality before God. In the South, revival meetings sometimes forced planters to see enslaved people as fellow worshippers, even when the basic structure of slavery remained unchanged. For women, the awakening opened new spaces for testimony, leadership in prayer groups, and even some forms of preaching, establishing traditions of female activism that would shape later American reform movements. The revivals also generated backlash. Critics accused itinerant preachers of encouraging fanaticism, undermining social hierarchy, and sapping respect for educated ministers. In some communities, these disputes became political. A minister's stance on the revival could influence public opinion, votes, and the distribution of public money for church support. Yet, despite the controversy, the Great Awakening served as a training ground for public argument, participatory assemblies, and grassroots organization, a sort of rehearsal for greater struggles to come. Intellectual life and the Enlightenment. If the pulpit and the revival tent were one center of colonial life, the press, coffeehouse, and debating society were another. American intellectual culture was increasingly influenced by Enlightenment thinking, a movement sweeping Europe that prized rationality science, empirical inquiry, and skepticism toward inherited authority. American versions of the Enlightenment were pragmatic and often religious, blending reverence for God as creator with a faith in the capacity of human beings to discover nature's laws, improve society, and build a better world. Benjamin Franklin, the most famous American philosopher of the period, embodied its ideals: printer, inventor, diplomat, experimenter, and moralist. His Poor Richard's Almanac, like the work of countless printers and editors, promised useful knowledge: how to plant crops, improve one's character, and make sense of the world. Colonial colleges founded to produce ministers began to support inquiry in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and the sciences. Newspapers, available even in small towns, spread news, essays, poetry, and arguments. American printers published not just laws and religious tracts, but work on natural history, practical medicine, and political theory. Coffee houses and taverns became spaces for men, and informally, for women, and even servants and laborers to read, discuss, and debate, creating a public sphere where information and opinion were exchanged, grievances aired, and local news spread as quickly as rumors. The growth of a colonial public, assembly, print, and protest. Through these networks, the church, the press, the meeting house, the market, Americans grew used to making their voices heard. Town meetings, especially in New England, allowed men to vote directly on local issues. Assemblies in every colony debated taxes, regulation, and the appointment of officials. Juries decided not only guilt and innocence, but the reach of law. Public protests over land, taxes, or regulation became increasingly common. The press amplified dissent. Pamphlets, letters, and essays passed hands from city to farms, connecting distant places in a common conversation. Political clubs, commercial societies, and mutual aid associations all fostered a sense that colonial interests were collective, not just personal. When, in the 1760s and 1770s, the British Parliament imposed new taxes and restrictions, these habits of association and argument, born from revival and reason cut together, would animate resistance. Committees of correspondence, mass meetings, boycotts, and petitions all grew out of the daily, century-spanning experience of talking, voting, disputing, and worshipping in public alongside one's neighbors. Change and tension at the threshold of revolution. Despite optimism and energy, colonial society remained full of contradiction. The ideals of equality preached in revival meetings stood alongside the reality of slavery and dispossession. Enlightenment rhetoric about liberty could exist within systems that denied freedom to the majority. Women remained largely excluded from formal power, though they found voice in church and household. Indigenous nations adapted or suffered as colonial expansion pressed ever further into the interior. Yet as ties of commerce, spirit, and opinion stretched across regions and classes, a sense of shared American identity began unevenly, incompletely, but unmistakably to emerge. Economic interdependence tied farmers and merchants, artisans and planters, north and south, city and field. The print culture carried news and protest from Boston to Charleston more quickly than a horse could ride. Religious awakenings and public argument taught colonists, for the first time, to see themselves as a people not merely governed, but capable of governing. Years before formal war broke out, then, the revolution was taking root in the minds and hearts of men and women across the colonies, in their faith, their work, their talk, and their dreams. As old certainties began to break down, Americans would soon face the challenge of making a new world not just for themselves, but for generations to come. Part 10. Crisis and Revolution. The birth of a new nation. By the middle of the 18th century, the British American colonies had outgrown their origins. Rooted in old traditions, but shaped by the new realities of a diverse land, these societies teemed with ambition, contradiction, and restless confidence. It was into this world, prosperous and fractious, hopeful and constrained, that the final fateful act of the colonial story would unfold, the imperial crisis that would rupture Britain's Atlantic Empire and ignite the American Revolution. The aftermath of war. The spark came in the wake of triumph. The 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War as it was known in America, had ended in 1763, with Britain as the unrivaled master of Eastern North America. The French threat, so long used to justify garrisons, taxes, and imperial intervention, was gone. Colonists celebrated, imagining decades of expansion and prosperity ahead. Yet the very victory that secured the colonies also sowed trouble. Britain's government faced crushing debt, having spent astronomical sums to conquer, fortify, and defend its new empire. The costs of maintaining order, from policing the vast Appalachian frontier to paying for soldiers needed to keep the peace with indigenous nations, seemed unending. The king's ministers believed the time had come for the Americans to pay their fair share. The tightening of the empire. To imperial planners in London, the solution was simple. Parliament would enact new legislation to regulate trade, raise revenue, and assert its supremacy. For decades, colonial assemblies had managed internal taxes, while imperial customs duties existed mainly as trade policy. Now, major new taxes and administrative reforms were imposed. First came the Sugar Act, signed in 1764, increasing enforcement of duties on foreign sugar and molasses. Then, in 1765, the Stamp Act A tax on all legal documents, newspapers, and printed materials became the flashpoint for outrage. For the first time, Parliament asserted its right to levy internal, direct taxes on the colonies, not just regulate their commerce. American colonists exploded in protest. By this stage, they were well practiced in public dissent through assemblies, newspapers, street meetings, and economic boycotts. Across the continent, Sons of Liberty organizations formed, pressuring stamp officers into resignation, organizing mass petitions, publishing defiant resolutions, and harrying supporters of the act. Stunned by the violence and the scale of resistance, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The truce was temporary. Neither side had given up its principles. The circle of protest and repression. Over the next decade, the pattern became all too familiar. Parliament levied new duties and tried to reinforce imperial authority first through the Townshend Acts, taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, then through stricter enforcement and the quartering of British troops in colonial cities. Each new measure met coordinated American resistance boycotts of British imports, assemblies, pamphlets, and sometimes violence. Boston became the crucible of conflict. Angry crowds confronted customs officials. British soldiers, sent to maintain order, were met with jeers and stones. Friction mounted until, in March 1770, troops fired on an unarmed crowd in what colonists quickly named the Boston Massacre. 5 civilians lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a free black sailor symbolizing the diverse stakes in colonial resistance. While British officials soon withdrew the troops and most taxes, The tension could not be undone. The tea issue brought the crisis to a boil. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sold in America at a reduced price, but with a tax attached. Colonial leaders saw the act as a veiled attempt to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them without representation. When shipments of tea arrived, resistance groups in New York, Philadelphia, and, most dramatically, Boston prevented their unloading. Disguised protesters famously dumped some 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, an act that became legend as the Boston Tea Party. The road to revolution. Britain's response was swift and harsh. The coercive acts, called Intolerable Acts by Americans, closed Boston's port, altered the Massachusetts Charter, made colonial officials answerable to Britain rather than local juries, and further allowed British troops to be quartered in private homes. These measures convinced even moderate colonists that their rights might be extinguished at any moment. Rather than isolate Boston, imperial punishment fostered unity. Colonies that had once squabbled over boundaries and trade now sent food, money, and words of encouragement. Committees of correspondence linked towns from New Hampshire to Georgia in a network of shared intelligence and common cause. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, a gathering of delegates from all colonies except Georgia. Their actions were measured but bold. They petitioned the king to redress their grievances, called for colonies to train their militias, and coordinated non-importation agreements to pressure British merchants. Neither side was ready to break, but both prepared for what might come next. In New England, towns stored powder and shot, militias drilled, and leaders like John Hancock and Samuel Adams kept watch for the first sign of repressive force. Lexington and Concord. From protest to war. On April 19, 1775, British regulars marched out of Boston, aiming to seize colonial arms in Concord and to arrest rebel leaders. Warned by riders like Paul Revere and local networks, Minutemen faced them at Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world echoed. More blood was shed at Concord Bridge. By the day's end, a running fight filled the roads back to Boston. The war had begun. Colonial militiamen and volunteers from across New England besieged British forces in Boston. A Second Continental Congress assembled and voted to create a Continental Army led by George Washington. Simultaneously, they sent a final petition to King George III, reaffirming loyalty but demanding redress an olive branch that was firmly rejected. By the close of 1775, fighting had erupted throughout the colonies at Bunker Hill near Boston, in Canada, at sea. Patriots were forced to decide: loyalty to crown or country, to tradition or to a new political experiment. The Declaration and beyond. Through the first half of 1776, the momentum for independence built rapidly. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, denounced monarchy and the notion that a distant island should rule a continent. It swept through American settlements, selling by the tens of thousands and stirring dreams of a new order. On July the 2nd, Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, it adopted the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's immortal phrasing, linking colonial grievances to universal rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In language both radical and familiar, Americans announced not just their separation from Britain, but the birth of a new nation, based at least in aspiration on popular consent and freedom. The unfinished revolution independence sparked years of brutal war and deep hardship. But in the forging of the revolution, the patterns of colonial America were remade. The habits of association, debate, and local action built in churches, taverns, assemblies, and resistance committees became the scaffolding for new states and, eventually, for a new experiment in republican government. Yet the revolution was incomplete, a struggle for independence, not yet for universal liberty. Slavery, dispossession of native peoples, and limits on women, the poor, and free blacks persisted. Still, the ideas, institutions, and memories hammered out in the colonial crucible gave birth to the United States, a nation forever shaped by the hopes, conflicts, and contradictions of its first 2 centuries. As the guns fell silent, the American story began anew, shaped by the voices and experiences of those who had made the land their own, and charged with the task of building, inhabiting, and defining a new world forged in the fires of revolution.